Well, I certainly hope so. And I can't tell you how glad I am to be with all of you today. The very fact of this symposium, the UNESCO meetings that follow, this is part of breaking the sound barrier of inevitability that the tech corporations have been able to secure for themselves for many, many years now. And so the sense of excitement around this meeting adds, I think, to the sense of our being at an inflection point at a time when we can begin to make shared, collective, global progress on the issues that we're here to discuss. So let me go through some reasoning here about what exactly it is that we are up against, and what might be some of the ways of thinking about solutions, new directions, a new frontier of this conversation that I think it may be helpful to introduce at this juncture in the third decade of the digital century. It is our shared fate, of course, to live at the dawn of information civilization. And what does that mean, information civilization? It earns its name from the new conditions of existence in which we find ourselves. We're living at a time when inclusion in the coordinates of the world's atlas requires that persons, and increasingly all that is animate and inanimate, are rendered as and mediated by digital information. But who knows that information? Who decides who knows? Who decides who decides? Who knows? These are the essential questions of knowledge, authority, and power that define the social order of our time. And yet here we are in the third decade, the third year of the third decade of the digital century. And it's the surveillance capitalist giants and their ecosystems, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, that hold the answers to each of these questions, though we never elected their owners to govern. You'll notice in my remarks that I do not and will not refer to these corporations as platforms, because I believe intrinsically that the language of platform is a kind of euphemism that hides the economic realities of these corporations and their profit maximizing activities. And it is those activities that really are the source of the problems that we've defined and the obstacles to the principles that UNESCO would like to achieve. So how did we get here? Just to go back a little bit briefly to the beginning, surveillance capitalism is what happened when United States' democracy stood down. From the emergence of the World Wide Web, democratic societies, beginning with the US, failed to construct a coherent political vision of a digital century that advances democratic values and principles and governance. All the way back to 1997, Clinton and Gore published their white paper on e-commerce and the future of the internet, and their very first and most central principle was stated at the start and repeated throughout: the private sector must lead. Government must get out of the way. There were to be no laws to inhibit tech innovation and development. If laws were on the books, they were going to be removed. Self-regulation was the order of the day. Just 3 years later, by the year 2000, a majority of the US Federal Trade Commission concluded that self-regulation on the internet cannot work. They saw the web bugs, they saw the cookies, They saw privacy already under relentless assault. And they submitted draft privacy legislation to the US Congress. Then came the trauma of 9/11, and the conversation was transformed. If the dots were to be connected, it was reasoned, they first had to be collected, all of them. Total information awareness was the new watchword. American lawmakers said it over and over again. What had begun as a US story quickly became a global story. Total information awareness, many governments, including most democratic governments, agreed. Bulk collection from the young internet companies was to be essential. And this is how the new information and communication spaces of the digital era were ceded to private companies without constraint from public law. This abdication left a void where democracy should be, a void that was quickly filled and tenaciously defended by surveillance capitalism. It has become the dominant economic paradigm in only 2 decades. And I know so many of us feel that it is entrenched and that it is inevitable and that democracy is simply not up to the task of reversing this. But I want to stress, this is only 2 decades. Powered by an amazing discovery, coupled with an extraordinarily brazen idea, both achieved at Google in the desperate search for revenue that was triggered by the dot-com crash. The discovery was this: with every connected action, users unknowingly leave a trail of highly predictive behavioral signals visible only to the machines. The breakthrough idea was this: those signals of private human experience could be secretly extracted, aggregated, and analyzed, free raw material for predictions of future behavior. Most significantly, such predictions could be sold in bulk, traded as commodities, like barrels of oil or tons of wheat. The new economic imperatives would flow from this revolutionary purpose, and I'll name just 3. First, the imperative of scale and speed. Bulk predictions require unimaginably vast and fast data flows. This means information systems must be blind by design, engineered to maximize the scale and speed of human signals communication and processing, but unable to judge the meaning, the quality, or the truthfulness of the information that flows through them. Blindness by design affords every purveyor of corrupt information instant access to the global information bloodstream without notice, constraint, or remedy. As Google's first CEO, Eric Schmidt, would later reflect, quote, "There is a line we really cannot cross. It is very difficult for us to understand truth." And mind you, this from a company whose mission has been to organize and make accessible the world's information. More recently, a leaked memo from Facebook privacy engineers reveals a growing sense of panic over the fundamental mismatch between the company's blind by design systems and the changing expectations of lawmakers, the public, all of us. The engineers compare their data flows to a bottle of ink poured into a lake. And they ask the question, quote, "How do you put that ink back in the bottle?" And their answer is simply, you cannot. It cannot be identified, nor can it be put back in the bottle. At least not with the systems that currently dominate our information spaces. A second imperative is engagement. Instead of truth and integrity, content is evaluated for its stickiness, its ability to engage user interaction, thus producing more behavioral signals to extract, better predictions, more revenue. This has been understood internally for a long time. Those of us who study it have understood this. And of course, now we have a raft of independent researchers who have demonstrated, and the public is now becoming aware, that corrupt information, that means extreme, controversial, violent, hateful, grotesque, draws the highest level of engagement. The result is an economics in which corrupt information is positively correlated with revenues and therefore enjoys greater privileges of algorithmic amplification. A third imperative is surveillance, which affords necessary secrecy, camouflage, and indecipherability. Common sense suggests that when you take something from a person without their knowledge and use it for your own advantage, it is theft. Any 10-year-old will tell you this. From the start, however, Google's leaders understood that the massive scale extraction of human data had to be secret. They imagined disastrous consequences if people were allowed to understand how the company was exploiting their personal information, and that users didn't know they were even leaking such information, let alone did they intend to share it. The leaders feared that users would reject Google services and seek alternatives, and that lawmakers would respond with comprehensive privacy laws. But in the shadows, Google and their successors were free to execute the massive scale theft of human data that would become the origin story of a new digital economy, surveillance capitalism. In this new era of capitalism, human data is the stolen treasure, and surveillance is the getaway car. The shadows endure. This has not been moved. The surveillance imperative established at the start continues to dominate. For example, a court document recently made public in a US class action privacy suit against Google includes internal documents that cite the views of current Google executives. And these comments are directly quoted. I'll share 3 with you. Quote, "If people were the deciders, they wouldn't take the deal, but they are not the deciders." Close quote. A second comment, quote, "Users don't understand what is going on." Close quote. And finally, quote, "Won't it creep people out to know how much we are paying attention?" Close quote. The public ignorance afforded by surveillance operations has been critical to sustaining surveillance capitalism as a generally law-free zone where its economic operations have not been fundamentally challenged in 2 decades. The click-through rate, as everybody knows, became surveillance capitalism's first blockbuster prediction product. The fledgling online ad industry was the first to become dependent on Google's machines, quickly turning the struggling startup into a powerhouse of profit. But the surveillance economics born at Google quickly traveled. First to Facebook, yes. The rest of the tech sector, yes. But the revenues produced in these prediction markets reset the investment paradigm more generally. It is now difficult for almost any business in any sector to resist the capital and the profits that flow from this foundational economic operation, the secret massive scale extraction of human data for prediction. Surveillance economics now travel far from Silicon Valley as they dominate every sector. I won't enumerate all of them, but there is hardly an exception. Whether we're talking about key sources of global profit and productivity in education and in healthcare, whether we're talking about finance or real estate, retail, insurance, literally every sector, the production of automobiles, white goods, consumer electronics, surveillance capitalism's fledgling startups on the back of this huge migration across sectors have transformed into a global institutional order, now intermediating virtually all human engagement with digital architectures. Critical to this success has been the absence of effective laws to challenge the commodification of the human and the secret operations upon which it depends. This is how the democracies forfeited the critical first decades of the digital century and deprived an increasingly connected global community, not only those societies that we name as democracies, but everyone on earth who is connected to these architectures has been deprived a clear path to a digital future free from these forces and with the distinct possibility of pursuing a democratic path into the digital century. The forfeit was all the more consequential in the global context, of course, because it was China that really proceeded in almost a diametrically opposite way. Since at least 2010, we know the Chinese have aggressively developed and designed digital technologies to advance their form of authoritarian governments, institutionalizing policies and practices that have become central to both domestic and foreign policies. So instead, the democratic forfeit abandoned all individuals and every society to new forms of digitally mediated violence. These new species of violence are not sui generis. They are the product of economic imperatives. They are linked in a multi-decade process of institutional development. Each creates the conditions for the next. Each builds on what went before. For the sake of those economic imperatives that follow from the commodification of the human and its operations of massive scale extraction and its enrichment of the few over the many, we now endure new forms of violence shaped by these 2 decades of institutional development, uninterrupted. These include, and I will not mention comprehensively, but to touch on key themes. These include, first and foremost, the destruction of privacy. I know that we're concerned about privacy. We're still trying to protect privacy and so on. But I think it's important to recognize that privacy, even as we knew it as recently as the year 2000, simply no longer exists. A second form of violence is represented in the systematic decoupling of information from considerations of truth and integrity. And this, of course, has created the conditions for rampant, uncontrolled, and uncontrollable disinformation and defactualization, disfiguring politics, eroding social solidarity, and threatening life itself. It's important for all of us to take a moment just to remind ourselves and all of those listening that this notion of threatening life itself is not simply a form of rhetoric or melodrama. In this year, 2022, just a few months ago, the commissioner of the US Food and Drug Agency, Dr. Robert Califf, announced that, quote, misinformation had become the leading cause of death in America, with a disturbing effect on Americans' life expectancy, end quote. And finally, we see corporate concentrations of human data enabling surveillance capitalist leaders, these corporate leaders, to dominate the global market in artificial intelligence, producing incalculable opportunity costs for global society, such as those that you've been discussing. In parallel, a new axis of social inequality is measured by the growing gap between what I can know and what can be known about me. As we look across the scale of violence, we also see that knowledge is now able to convert itself into power, as massive scale human data enables the remote actuation of individual and collective behavior through mechanisms known, again, euphemistically as targeting, meaning subliminal cues that shape, manipulate, and modify attitudes and behaviors to align with commercial and increasingly with political objectives. And now we see, as we progress toward the most recent stages of institutional development, we're seeing increasingly from these corporate leaders that their concentrations of data, knowledge, and power have produced unaccountable, complete control over critical information infrastructure. The surveillance capitalist leaders have demonstrated quite recently their increasing willingness to leverage this control in their bid for not just economic dominance, but also political dominance. Examples include Facebook's showdown with the Australian people and its parliament over the new publishing code in 2021. And in the EU, the Apple Google showdown with the European Commission and member states over the control of contact tracing and exposure notification mobile operations. This showdown, of course, which emerged in April 2020 at the early stages of the shock and spiraling death rates from the global pandemic. So where are we now? We are 2 decades into a global social experiment in the unregulated private control of the digital information and communication spaces that are mission critical to life, to social solidarity, to shared prosperity, and to the endurance of democracy in an information civilization. The evidence suggests that the surveillance capitalists have failed any reasonable test of responsible global stewardship in these spaces, and the abdication of these spaces to surveillance capitalism, which began as a US story, has become the meta crisis of every republic because it obstructs solutions to all other crises. No democracy can survive these conditions. Now, every democracy and every struggling to be democratic society, every aspirational democratic society now stumbles toward a future that its citizens did not and would not choose. An accidental dystopia owned and operated by private surveillance capital, but all too frequently underwritten by democratic acquiescence, collusion, and dependency. These are the conditions against which we must judge the next phases of regulation, of legislation, and of institution building. The question is, can we regulate our way through this meta crisis? For example, research just last year from the Irish Council for Civil Liberties revealed Google's transmission of real-time bidding data to advertisers. Turns out, in the United States, where the federal government has yet to pass basic privacy protections, the average person's online activity and location data are exposed in these real-time bidding flows 747 times each day. In Europe, where data protection laws lead the world, where privacy leads the world, the average person is exposed 376 times a day. Does regulation make a difference? Yes, it does. But when it comes to the foundational economic operations of secret extraction, is regulation enough? Apparently, no, it is not. Consider the principles that UNESCO has articulated, that platforms respect human rights in content moderation and curation, that platforms use transparency, empower users, are accountable to relevant stakeholders, and conduct human rights due diligence. My friends, the sober truth is that no one of these principles is compatible with the economic imperatives I have outlined. No one of these is compatible with the corporation's joint record of stewardship. I suggest that this third decade is a pivotal moment when the accrued power of the surveillance capitalists demands a comprehensive democratic vision that is fully attuned to the realpolitik of this meta crisis, its economic imperatives, and the operations that instantiate it, that bring it to life in every aspect of society. To achieve the principles outlined by UNESCO, we must recognize, I believe, that piecemeal regulation of commercial processes that are genuinely catastrophic for democracy will not produce the change we need. We have faced such challenges before. Consider child labor. It was eventually understood in most industrial societies that child labor cannot be simply regulated. 5 hours per day for a 5-year-old, 10 hours per day for a 12-year-old, it's all wrong. It was finally understood that child labor had to be abolished. Consider human slavery. In John Meacham's new biography of Abraham Lincoln, he clearly distinguishes Lincoln by something that set him apart from most of his peers and certainly most of his political peers. From an early age, he understood and held the enduring conviction that the categorical immorality of slavery made it categorically catastrophic for democracy. He saw no compromise. He saw no possibility of regulation. He stood for that, and he stood for that to the end. In our time, the commodification of the human and its operationalization in the secret massive scale extraction of human data are categorically catastrophic for people, for society, and for the democratic prospect. Right now, we all, every citizen of every society, everyone who is connected, marches naked, easy prey for all who steal and hunt with human data. Abolition opens the way to reinvention, where data collection is finally tied to human rights, and data use is guided by the public good, where the digital lives in democracy's house under the rule of public law, as does every other mission-critical domain of society. The 20th century saw the creation of new rights, new laws, and new institutions, the necessity for which had never existed before the rise and dominance of industrial capitalism, before employers' privacy rights were privileged above all other considerations. Today, new charters of rights are critical because today humanity encounters threats that were never before imaginable. Today, new legal frameworks to oversee and protect those rights are critical. And I want to stress here that the answer to the problems that I've outlined is not a shift from data held in the marketplace to data held within our governments. My view is that it is essential that we get to work creating the new public institutions purpose-built for our time. just as we created public institutions for the 20th century that oversaw the laws and rights purpose built for that time, for that century, for those threats. Today, we need a new institutional domain, one that is created to bind now the digital and all of its expressions, to bind the digital to the democratic prospect, to bind it finally to democratic values and principles. Institutions endure. Institutions endure under public law despite politics and partisanship. And that is the quality of institutional domain that is required from us today. We need to begin again in the spaces sold cheap only 20 years ago, sold cheap by Clinton and Gore, sold cheap again in 2001. We need to begin again and reclaim the void that we have left. Reclaim that void, because now we know what we have lost, and now we know what is at stake. Democracy, they say, is old. They say it's slow. They laugh at its messiness, its confusion. But democracy has strengths that are difficult to match. It inspires action. Just ask the people of Ukraine if you doubt me. And democracy alone retains the authority and power to make, impose, and enforce laws that advance the cause of democratic governance. It's not that the work of creating a digital and democratic century is impossible. It's that this work has only just begun. And with that, I hope we have time for a couple of questions that allow us to pursue some of these themes. Thank you so very much.
And thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very powerful speech and this strong conclusion and this very categoric conclusion. It's a challenge for us all. So regulation or abolition, new institution.
Hi, my name is Omri Price from Alliance for Europe and the Disarm Foundation. Thanks very much for the talk that you gave. I hope you can hear me on the screen.
I can. Can you just tell me again where you're from? I couldn't quite make that out.
Yes, my name is Omri Price from Alliance for Europe. We're a nonprofit that works on democracy in Europe, essentially countering some of the authoritarianism that is driven by the business models that you're talking about. And I think you really talk a lot about what the problem is, and your analysis is really crystal clear, and thank you very much for putting it out there in such powerful terms. I would like to ask you to say more about the solution and what the solution looks like. Of course, there are things we can do in terms of countering disinformation in real time, strategic communications, media literacy, things like that. It seems to me that what you're talking about is much more profound. You're talking about a different kind of capitalism, right? So could you say something about what other business models would look like, or what publicly funded, perhaps, digital infrastructure would look like? Because at the end of the day, this will only make sense if there is a financial logic to it, if it pays for itself. And either the government does it, or the private sector does it, or it's a combination of the two, but someone needs to pay for scalable digital technology. And you're very, very focused in a crystallized way on what the problem is. I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about the solution here.
I think the solution begins with what I think of as eliminating the surveillance dividend. In other words, what I've described to you is a system where the financial incentives are so strong that it is difficult for other business models, such as those you quickly mentioned, and many other kinds of economic models, whether they are through public ownership, through different forms of collectivities, through new forms of business with different economics. Whatever there will be many of these from all these different modalities that are really at this point, I would say, queued up, waiting for their chance to come on stream. But the financial incentives are all directed toward the surveillance dividend, which relies upon what I've said over and over again, that secret massive scale collection of human data for commodity prediction. So, in my view, we have a very concrete goal here. If you go back to the early stages of big tech's incursion, for example, into the music industry, big tech's incursion into the news industry, these early stages of what was, again, euphemized as disruption, as creative destruction. In those early stages, in the conversations in each of those industries, people talked about the fact that they're stealing from us. There was a sense that a kind of profound institutional theft was underway. And yet there are a lot of reasons. I won't go into all the reasons because I'll just be doubling down on diagnosis, which will frustrate you. But I think we all imagine the various reasons that went into this, from rhetoric to a sense of technology's inevitability and the idea that this was the only way digital technology could work. But for a variety of reasons, led by our democratic governments, voluntary self-evisceration at the hands of this economic ideology that prided itself on economic self-regulation, market self-regulation. And so these forms of theft were never named as theft. No one stood up against them. The newspaper publishers did not stand up the way, in retrospect, they could have. Nor did the music industry, nor did any other industry that came later. And of course, over a period of time, as industry after industry fell, the sense of really being able to carve a different path and get any assistance from democratic government, that sense faded. If democratic governments could turn their back on the fourth estate and allow the news industry to be interrupted, then where was there going to be hope for other industries? So I believe that it is time for this conversation. It's only been 20 years. And in the scale of the entire century that awaits us, is 20 years is still the beginning. If we think about, at least in my country in the 20th century, the critical rights and laws and institutions needed to balance the interests of democracy with industrial capitalism weren't even developed until the fourth decade of that century, most of them. So this is where I start, by taking aim at the financial incentives and making that kind of that theft finally illegal. That's what I mean by abolition. And I believe when we start looking at abolition, what we will see is that pulling out that infrastructure, that's the foundation of all the layers of institutional development that have followed, we pull that out, we're shutting down the origin story. And once we shut that down, all the rest of these capabilities are no longer going to be able to stand. The blind by design systems no longer have any meaning. the idea of the concentrations of data that lead to information oligarchy over the production of knowledge and the whole global landscape of artificial intelligence. Without those vast concentrations of human data, none of that can stand. Without the vast concentrations of data, the targeting capabilities fall away, most of which have been shown to be illegitimate and illicit. The problem is they're not illegal. So in my view, we're now talking about, I used the word oligarchy a minute ago, we're not talking about an innovative sector of our economies that meets Schumpeter's actual standard of creating the kind of prosperity that lifts all boats. This is information oligopoly that has shaded into societal oligarchy. This is not a sector now characterized by innovation and all of the things we seek. And the data that exists, the massive global caches of data that exist, are not being put to work on the real problems of people and society and planet. So I think that if we can link arms and develop the collective strategies, and by that I mean people organizing, it's not going to be a carbon copy of organizing for workers' rights and consumer rights in the last century, but it will be students organizing and professionals organizing and neighbors organizing, and people whose lives, whose personal experience is marked by potential for certain kinds of data. All the women in my family died of a specific cancer. I want to donate my biological data to those organizations who are actively researching to bring an end to such a cancer. These kinds of volunteer-based collectivities where the decision rights over what becomes data, with whom it is shared, and for what purpose, are reintegrated as human rights, as individual rights, and collective rights, and so forth. So my perspective on this, to bring all this to an end, we go after the financial incentives. The financial incentives immediately do two things when they are curbed. The first is that they break apart the sources of power that the surveillance capitalist order now enjoys. And the second is that they immediately open the landscape for varieties of competitors, private sector, public sector, new kinds of collectivities, to finally bring data to bear on the real problems that face humanity in this century. I know I haven't answered every single thing that I have to say about this, but I'm worried about time and getting another question in under our belts before.
Thank you very much. So you have time for a last question?
I do. I hope you do.
We certainly do.
I'll stay as long as you like.
Hello, Shoshana. This is Mathias Dufour from The Most Important. If you were at the place of the Secretary General of UNESCO, with both high power and also the constraint brought about by your member states, what would you try to achieve?
I think we're at a place now where moving forward depends on politics. And here there are some things that I would advise in this thought experiment that will probably be uncomfortable to hear. For example, the last 20 years have been characterized by multi-stakeholder deliberations. Multi-stakeholder deliberations have been shown to give the corporations the largest voice at the table. And for 20 years, we have believed that the corporations would voluntarily alter the conditions that I've described to you, and this has not occurred. We increasingly understand, and I've tried to convey a little bit of this, that not only have they not altered, but we're increasingly understanding that they cannot alter. That there are things that are baked into their operations that cannot be altered through their institutional operations. That's why content moderation has become such a phenomenon. The only way they can make changes in what they produce is by going ex machina, by exiting the system, hiring people who are paid, despite the rhetoric, primarily lowest possible wages to do the most horrific work with very little training and very little authority. And so we've got these pasted up human activities that are set forward as if they can actually make a dent in the scale and scope of the problems we face, when of course any reasonable analysis would lead one to believe that they cannot make a dent. They are there performatively, and people are suffering as a result of our buying into that content moderation theater, as it were, solution theater, as it were. So I think we have to take a very hard look at multi-stakeholder decision making, and we have to admit to ourselves that there are not shared interests in this terrain that I have described. There is adversarialism. In fact, in my latest work, I call this a death match between the two dominant institutional orders on Earth today, one being surveillance capitalism and the other being the democratic order. And I privilege democracy here because I regard it as the only institutional order on Earth today that has the wherewithal to take down, to challenge these financial incentives and interrupt these foundations that are fundamentally illegitimate. So politics now is going to be required for us to achieve the force in society that we need to mobilize lawmakers and move us forward. So by politics, I mean that the grassroots needs to be mobilized. By politics, I mean that citizens need to be mobilized. I mean that collectives and other ways that we are joined together in collectives, these need to be instantiated and mobilized, because we need to bring the people's voice, the public voice, to bear. I am very confident about this, very optimistic about this, because having pored over every single piece of survey data going back to the early part of the 21st century, we today, and we have now for several years, at least for maybe 5 years, we have seen majorities of citizens in the United States, where our government has been most recalcitrant, in Europe, and I've just come back from South America, where I've seen in Chile in particular, very similar survey data, where we're seeing majorities of citizens in the 90th and 80th percentiles saying tech has too much power. We're afraid of it. We're terrified by it. We want laws to curb it. We want a different path forward. And people are looking to democracy, to our institutions, to our governments, to break this path forward, to give us the opening. And of course, everyone who is at odds with what I'm saying will hold open the idea that, well, they may be saying that they don't like us, but they're using us all the time. So why should we believe that they don't like us? And deep down, they really love us. And of course, the point is that over these 20 years, in the shadows, and as a result of the absence of law, it has been possible to create a world of no escape, where there literally are no longer opportunities to move out of these channels into significant, meaningful alternatives without giving up all the fundamentals of social participation upon which our lives depend. So politics means not multi-stakeholder decision-making. Politics means using our most respected international institutions to mobilize our publics in new ways, as individuals at the grassroots, as new collectivities for new institution building, and to bring these new mobilizations into an active modality so that our lawmakers feel the force at their backs. The only force they presently feel at their backs, the only people knocking on their doors all day, are the lobbyists bought and paid for by the very institutional order that we seek to overcome, to neuter, to dispatch. And therefore we need the forces of democracy, citizens and their new organizations, their new collectivities, driving this. This, of course, means civil society leading along with democracy. It means that we're using the capabilities and the incredible talent in our critical institutions, such as, you know, be it UNESCO, the OECD, using these unique global capabilities and understanding of the democratic prospect and commitment to it, to move the dial in this deeply political way.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yes, please. Hi, Shoshana. I'm Christophe
Yes.
from the Radical Exchange.
Really the last way. I would have.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't expect to ask two questions. I am from the Radical Exchange movement. I would like to ask one question with regard to data coalition or data trusts. Do you think that they could be part of that action from citizens and grassroots to legalize or enforce some negotiations and collective bargainings with platforms to regain this rights and privilege to opt in for the data use that they want?
Well, I think that data coalitions and data collectivities have are full of potential and have a the principles that have given rise to these ideas of data collectivities, data coalitions. These are critical principles because we're getting back to the roots in linking data production to human rights and to the roots of using data for public good. My concern, and this is of course a theme in most of what I've discussed this afternoon. My concern is that these entities on their own simply do not have the requisite power to confront the corporations on their own terms. The data collectivity in concert with lawmakers, in concert with the new institutions that we will be standing up to protect rights and laws purpose-built for this century. In that context, then I think it becomes a very exciting idea and a very meaningful idea because it gets us right down to the grassroots of allowing people to decide what becomes data in the first instance. This is why data protection, is not the right starting point, because so much of what has become data, for example, the continuous tracking of my location, not all of it should be data in the first place. There are things that should never have become data that we never would have disclosed if we had known it was going on and had had the choice. So we go back to this very basic level. What becomes data in the first place? How is it shared? With whom is it shared? For what purpose? How do we oversee that? How do we enforce it? How do we police it? And how do we make sure that it remains true to the principles that have been set, the democratic principles that have been set to oversee it? So I hope I've given you some kind of answer to your question. I guess the summary is sort of yes and no, but yes, under the right conditions.
So thank you. Bravo. Bravo. Thank you very much for this outstanding exchange and outstanding conclusion. So I will give it to Matthias for some last words.
I think we are largely over time, and we are so thankful to you, Shoshanna, for taking this long time. We didn't expect so much from you, and it was so much worth it because you had the time to expand on your ideas and to engage us. I think that the key word now, it was a real call to action that you send us, and to, in our view, this symposium and more globally the UNESCO conference is just a start. Just like for environment is the COP, which is on an annual basis. We hope that UNESCO will keep moving. The guidance is just the beginning, and we need to keep pushing the needle. Thank you so much for inspiring us the way you do.